Could love truly be enough when society says it can never be? What if the most powerful man in the kingdom, a king, falls for someone he could never have? A simple maid who must remain invisible, hidden in the shadows of the grand castle. How could she possibly love him back when even the thought of being with him is forbidden? Stay with me to find out how love, fate, and duty collide in a way no one could have predicted. In a kingdom where the walls of its castle echo with power and authority, there was one name that everyone feared: King Alden. Strong, commanding, and impossibly cold, his heart had never been moved by the pleas of his people. His every decision was driven by duty, not desire. But beneath that iron mask, there was something only the maids saw. Elara, a quiet maid who worked in the royal household, never imagined her life would intertwine with his. Born into a humble family, she was just another invisible face in the castle, her world spinning around sweeping floors and caring for the king's needs. She had no intention of drawing his attention, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. It all began the day she was assigned to serve him, handing him his morning tea as he gazed out over the kingdom's vast landscape. She'd seen him from a distance before, but up close he was something else entirely. His eyes, dark and full of untold stories, met hers, and for a fleeting moment, something shifted. It was as if time stopped, the weight of his gaze heavier than the crown upon his head. Elara tried to forget it, to bury the strange feeling deep inside her. But each time she looked into his eyes, there was something undeniable, something magnetic that pulled her closer. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. She was just a maid after all. Her place was in the background, never in the light of his world. But as their paths crossed more frequently, her heart began to stir. She had to fight it, resist it, because she knew, deep down, that nothing could ever come of this forbidden connection. King Alden, too, found himself torn. He could no longer ignore the warmth in Elara's eyes, the kindness in her touch. In a life full of politics and cold strategy, Elara was a breath of fresh air, a reminder of the simple things he had long forgotten. He saw in her a softness he'd never allowed himself to believe in, but his heart remained locked away. She was beneath him, a mere maid in a world where only power mattered. Yet as days turned into weeks, it became clear to him that no matter how hard he tried, he could not erase her from his thoughts. Their love was never meant to be, yet neither could escape its pull. They shared stolen moments in the corridors of the castle, a brief glance here, a whisper there. But every touch, every glance, came with the knowledge that the world around them would never allow them to be anything more than this, mere shadows of something real. Elara knew she could never be his bride, no matter how much she wanted it. And Alden knew that his kingdom's expectations were far too great to let his heart lead him astray. Yet still, the longing grew. With every fleeting moment, the walls around them began to crumble, but they both knew that one wrong move could shatter everything. Could love truly conquer the walls of duty, or was it destined to be just another unspoken dream? 5 years ago, the castle was a different place. The halls, once cold and imposing, were filled with warmth and laughter, at least for a brief moment. It was then that Elara and King Alden had met for the first time, not as master and maid, but as two souls caught in the simplest of moments. She was a young servant, tending to the king's garden, when he wandered outside one spring afternoon, lost in thought. The air was fresh with the scent of blooming roses, and the sunlight bathed the garden in a golden glow. She hadn't expected him to approach, but he did, quietly, without fanfare. His dark eyes were fixed on the roses, his fingers brushing gently against the petals. He was distant, as he always was, but something about the moment felt different. Elara, holding a watering can, had paused to watch him for a moment. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting exchange, there was an understanding, silent yet profound. He said nothing. She said nothing. But in that silence, there was a connection. Days passed, and the moments between them grew, though still subtle. An accidental brushing of shoulders in the hallways, a soft smile shared during the rare occasions their paths crossed, It was nothing more than fleeting curiosity at first, but it soon became more. Alden began seeking her out, not in a commanding way, but in quiet moments, when the castle was still and the world outside seemed far away. One afternoon, while the evening sun cast long shadows on the stone floors, he found her in the royal library, reading a book by the window. He stood in the doorway, watching her, and for a moment, neither spoke. Elara could feel his gaze on her, though she didn't look up immediately. When she did, she saw something in his eyes, a softness that had never been there before, a crack in the armor. Alden stepped closer, and without thinking, she stood, her heart racing. They both knew that standing so close was dangerous, yet neither could seem to pull away. The castle's rules, his kingdom's expectations, hung heavily in the air, yet it was as if the moment was suspended, just for them. And in that pause, something was said without words. "I'll never forget this," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed in her chest. It was a promise, a declaration of something neither of them could fully grasp at the time. But fate, as it always does, had its own plans. That night, Elara left a small gift on Alden's desk, a wildflower, one she had picked from the garden. It was a small gesture, but one that symbolized everything that had grown between them. The next morning, Alden was gone, summoned away on royal business. He didn't return for weeks, and when he did, everything had changed. The distance between them grew, not because of a single moment, but because of what had been left unsaid, what had been left unexplored. The promise of forever was swallowed up by his duties, his kingdom, and the walls that no longer seemed as easy to cross. And so she buried her feelings deep inside. But she never forgot that afternoon beneath the golden sun, or the way his eyes held hers in the silence of the library. Years passed, but the memories never faded. And now, as she served him once again in the halls of the castle, she could still feel the echo of that moment, like a secret, buried in the deepest part of her heart. It had been years since that quiet afternoon in the library, but now, in the castle's grand halls, the air between Elara and Alden was thick with tension. The connection that once felt like destiny now felt like a cruel reminder of what could never be. Their stolen moments had grown fewer, and with each one, the weight of their unspoken love pressed heavier on them both. Elara couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She had always known she was nothing more than a maid in the eyes of the world, but now it felt like a chain that tightened with each passing day. She was powerless in the face of her feelings for Alden. The king had a duty to his kingdom, to his people, and to a future that had already been planned for him. His heart had never been truly his own. It had always belonged to the throne. Alden, too, found himself drowning in a sea of responsibilities. As the ruler of the kingdom, he was expected to marry for power, for alliance. His people demanded it, his family demanded it, and his heart remained tethered to the past, to a time when love had seemed so simple. But that time was long gone. As he watched Elara from across the grand hall, his thoughts swirled in turmoil. He wanted to call out to her, to finally tell her what he had never dared to say. But what could he say? "I love you" felt like a lie wrapped in a truth too painful to face. He wasn't just any man, he was the king, and kings didn't follow their hearts. They followed the crown. Elara's heart ached as she watched him stand so regal and distant, his gaze momentarily meeting hers before he turned away. She knew what he was thinking, what he was feeling. The sorrow in his eyes was clear. And yet, even in that sorrow, she couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. Too late for what? Too late for them, for this forbidden love that had no future. She had come to accept that they would never be together. But why did it still hurt so much? The whispers around the castle only made it worse. Rumors of potential marriages swirled through the court. The pressure on Alden to choose a bride weighed on him like an unrelenting storm. And in the quiet corners of the palace, Elara could hear the same whispers. "She's just a maid. He could never choose her." Every day, she grew more resigned to the truth. She couldn't be with him, not now, not ever. She had her place, here in the shadows of his world, where she would remain. But even as she accepted this bitter reality, something in her still fought against it. Could they really never have a future? Was love truly that powerless against the weight of duty and tradition? And for Alden, the internal struggle was just as fierce. The promises he made to himself, the promises of duty, honor, and legacy, clashed violently with the burning desire to hold Elara, to be with her, to make a life with her. But how could he? He had built this kingdom, this legacy, for a reason. He was not free to choose his own happiness. As the days passed, each encounter felt like a final goodbye. The more he saw her, the more he wanted to reach for what he couldn't have. Every touch, every fleeting moment of connection only reminded him of how impossible it all was. The closer they became, the further they were pushed apart by forces neither of them could control. The rain had started to fall, light at first, then heavier, until it poured down in sheets, drenching the stone courtyard outside the castle. Elara stood by the window, her fingers pressed against the cold glass as she watched the storm. It mirrored the storm inside her heart. The weight of everything unsaid, everything unspoken, hung between her and Alden like a storm cloud that would never clear. He had come for her tonight, unexpectedly, without warning. He had sought her out in the quiet of the evening, when the castle was shrouded in shadows, and no one was watching. His presence was overwhelming, as always, and yet tonight, something was different. His expression was tortured, raw, like a man on the edge of a decision that could change everything. Elara turned to face him as he stepped into the room, his clothes soaked from the rain, his hair darkened by the downpour. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their gazes locked, each of them holding something back, something that threatened to break free at any moment. Elara. His voice was strained, barely a whisper, but it held a weight that made her heart skip a beat. She took a step back, trying to steady herself. "What are you doing here, Alden?" He ran a hand through his wet hair, frustration and desperation flickering in his eyes. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice shaking with emotion. I can't do this anymore." Her breath caught in her throat. She had known for so long that this moment would come, but hearing it from him, hearing the words she had longed to hear, was both a dream and a nightmare. She crossed her arms, trying to shield herself from the intensity of his gaze. "You can't do this. You're the king. You have responsibilities. A future that doesn't include someone like me." Her voice trembled, betraying the calm facade she had so carefully constructed. "You've made your choice, Alden. You've always made your choice, and it was never me." He took a step forward, his hands reaching out to her, desperate to bridge the distance between them. "I never chose this. I never chose any of this," he said, his voice breaking with the weight of his words. "But I chose you, Elara. I always have. And I know now, if I don't have you, I'll lose everything. My kingdom, my crown, my soul. I'm not asking for permission anymore. I'm asking for you." Elara's heart ached, the truth of his words cutting deeper than any blade. But still, a part of her resisted. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to throw caution to the wind and be with him, to let love conquer all. But she knew the cost. "Don't say that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't make promises you can't keep. You'll destroy everything. You'll destroy us." The rain lashed against the window as they stood there, the silence deafening. He reached for her hand, pulling it gently toward him, his touch burning against her skin. "Tell me you never loved me," she said, her voice breaking, her heart pounding in her chest. "Tell me you never loved me, and I'll walk away forever." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. She waited for his response, her eyes searching his for a hint of the truth. His hands clenched at his sides, his breath ragged, and for a moment it seemed as though he was fighting something far greater than himself. The storm outside roared louder, as if urging him to speak, but the silence that followed was deafening. He couldn't say the words. He couldn't lie to her, not now, not after everything they had shared. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His hands trembled as they cupped her face, his touch gentle, yet filled with an unbearable intensity. "I can't lose you, Elara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you." And in that moment, everything changed. The storm outside didn't matter anymore. The kingdom, the crown, the expectations of his people, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the truth between them. But would it be enough to overcome the insurmountable walls they had built around themselves? Or was this love destined to be yet another broken dream? The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, and the world outside seemed still, quiet and heavy with the weight of their decisions. The room, once filled with tension, now felt strangely calm. Elara stood there, her hand still in his, her heart racing with the fear of what might come next. Alden's gaze never left her, his eyes searching hers for an answer he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. His world had always been about duty, about the future that was mapped out for him. But now, with Elara in his arms, he wondered if that future had ever really belonged to him at all. Maybe it had always belonged to her, to the love they had once shared. "I've spent so long running from what I truly want," he said softly, his voice thick with regret. "But I can't run anymore, Elara. Not from you. Not from us." She hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on her like 1,000 pounds. "Alden, you don't understand," she whispered. "You don't get to choose your future, your kingdom, your crown. They're bigger than us. I can't be the one who stands in your way." He shook his head, frustration clouding his features. "I never wanted to choose between you and the kingdom. I never wanted to choose anything at all." His voice cracked. "But I can't live this life without you. I can't keep pretending that I don't need you. I can't pretend that this—" He paused, lifting his hand to her face, his fingers brushing the tears that had started to fall from her eyes. "This isn't everything to me." She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the sting of the truth in his words. But something inside her hesitated. Something deep inside her heart knew that the road they were about to take was filled with more than just love. It was filled with sacrifice, and even though she had always loved him, she wasn't sure if she could be the one to bear the weight of that sacrifice. "Alden." Her voice was barely a whisper, a fragile thing on the edge of breaking. "I love you. I've always loved you. But I can't be the one to ruin your future. I can't." He gently cupped her face, his touch tender, his eyes desperate. "I won't let this ruin us. I promise you." He took a deep breath, as though gathering the strength to say what he needed to. "I will give up everything, my crown, my title, my kingdom, if it means I can have you. You are my future, Elara. You're all I want. No one else matters." Her heart swelled with the force of his words, and yet a small voice inside her whispered doubts. Could it really be that simple? Could they really have a life together without the weight of the world pushing against them? She pulled away gently, her hand resting against her chest. "What if we can't have everything we want, Alden? What if this love isn't enough to build the future we need?" He stepped back slightly, as if giving her the space she needed. "I can't promise that everything will be easy, but I promise we'll face it together. I'll choose you, Elara, every day for the rest of my life." She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time in years, saw the man who had always been so consumed by duty and responsibility, but now stood before her as someone willing to fight for love, to fight for them. And in that moment, she realized that it wasn't about choosing between duty and love. It was about choosing to build a new path, one where love and sacrifice could coexist. Her heart told her to stay. It told her to let herself trust in the possibility of a future with him, no matter the cost. With a shaky breath, she stepped toward him. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her decision. "Okay, Alden, let's try. Together." Alden's face lit up with relief and hope, his hands pulling her into his embrace. The world outside had stopped. No longer the kingdom, no longer the crown, no longer the pressures of the court. It was just the two of them now, standing at the edge of something new, something fragile and uncertain. But it was their something. And for the first time in years, Elara felt as though she had a future that was truly hers. As they held each other in the quiet of the room, the storm outside slowly began to fade, and with it, the fears that had haunted them both. Maybe it wasn't the perfect ending, but it was theirs to shape. Together. Alden kissed her forehead softly, and with a final whisper, he spoke the words that would carry them forward. No matter what happens, I will always choose you. And as they stood there, the future seemed just a little less uncertain. Is love enough to defy fate? Can two hearts, torn apart by duty and time, find their way back to each other? Sometimes, love isn't about perfect endings. It's about the courage to choose it again and again, even when the world says it's impossible. What would you do if the love of your life came back, asking you to take a chance, to rewrite the future together? Would you let go of everything or hold on to the one thing that truly matters?